So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today, Haley White and Emily Curlin. Haley and Emily are counseling interns here at Insight Counseling Centers. Haley is pursuing a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling at University of the Cumberlands. She sees clients online through telehealth and in person in Insight's office in Franklin, Tennessee. And Emily is pursuing a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling at Colorado Christian University. She sees clients at Insight's Nashville office and also online through telehealth as well. So with that, Emily and Haley, thank you for being here with us today. And I will pass the mic over to you.
All right, thank you so much and welcome everybody to our webinar on quarter life crisis, the most underrated crisis I would probably say that's happening within our age range that we're going to be talking to today. Emily, do you want to tell just a little bit about your background before we hop in, and then I can go after you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Haley. As Abby said, my name is Emily. I am a counseling intern at Insight. I'm getting my master's at a school out in Denver, but I get to do all of my classes online. So I'm finishing up my last semester this fall, and then we'll work on licensure for an LPC here in Tennessee. I kind of have a background I did a lot of different jobs, but the last few years I was in full-time ministry, working at a multi-site church where I would kind of say I was a campus pastor, and did that for a couple years and realized the thing that I loved about ministry was the pastoral and the counseling side that comes with it. So made the decision kind of in the middle of a quarter life crisis, as we'll talk about more, to go and get my master's in counseling and kind of begin that journey of doing what I love that kind of was birthed out of ministry. So that's a little bit about me and how I got here.
Yeah, and I am also pursuing an LPC track. I like how you said LPC in Tennessee, just as it has a nice little ring to it. But I am pursuing clinical mental health counseling degree through University of the Cumberlands, which is in Kentucky. It's all online. And then I am on the LPC track here. I'll be done in December as well. And I am very similar to Emily in that I was in the middle of a quarter life crisis when I decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go pursue to be a therapist or a counselor. And so that has been my pursuit since then. For me, I meet a lot with adolescents and individuals that are going through the crisis like we're going to talk about today. And it's just been a journey. It's been a lot of fun. And Emily and I both are just excited to jump into this and to just inform you a little bit more about this. So we're going to go ahead and jump ahead. I want to make sure my slides working. Awesome. So in the great words of John Mayer, he has the song, Why Georgia? I rent a room and I fill the spaces with wooden places to make it feel like home, but all I feel is alone. It might be a quarter life crisis or just a stirring in my soul. So it could be that even John Mayer recognized that quarter life crisis is real. And that's what we're going to be just tackling today. So what exactly is a quarter life crisis? Typically you see it affecting ages between 22 and 30. And Meredith Goldstein with the Boston Globe describes it as occurring in between your 20s and after you enter the quote unquote real world. So that could be you've graduated college, or maybe you're moving out of your home that you've lived in for the past 20 or so years. You're deciding to make a career change. And so that's what that looks like. It's almost this period of uncertainty and questioning that typically occurs when you're starting to feel maybe a little bit trapped. You've already finished college. Now you're like, what is it that's about to happen? And I think a lot of times our generation and younger gets labeled as the Peter Pan generation, this idea that we just don't ever want to grow up. We don't want to grow up. We don't want responsibility. And while maybe there's an element of that is true, I think it's almost projected onto this generation and our generation and lower, because Emily and I both are closer to 30 than we're not. So I think there's this idea that's projected onto us that we don't want responsibility and that we run from it. And so we're called the Peter Pan generation. But according to the Federal Reserve Board, in just the pandemic over the past year or so, 33% of Gen Zers and 25% of millennials lost their job. And so you compare that to what it was for the baby boomers. So of course there is almost this very justified fear about, well, when we got into the real world, a pandemic happened and now we don't know what to do. And that's kind of where we're at right now.
So when talking kind of about that quarter life crisis, and I think specifically that generation, kind of 22 to 30, that time frame, as Haley said, we are both closer to 30 than we're not, but we're not there yet. And so there's a lot of misconceptions that I think come with that season of 20s to 30s. I think a lot of it is that kind of myth that it's supposed to be the best time of your life and the most fun in your life, and you're supposed to kind of explore who you are and figure things out. And maybe you're supposed to be married and have children, or maybe you're supposed to wait till later. So you're preparing for all of that kind of, time to travel, time to do all this stuff that sounds really great. But I think there's an element of pressure and expectation that comes with that. And then when we don't meet those, or those things don't happen, there's a kind of a byproduct of disappointment that comes with that. And so I think that contributes to the quarter life crisis and the feelings that come with that. And when I was in ministry at one point, we had a really large church staff, and they had asked all of us who were under the age of like 33 and below to sit in a room and to speak aloud kind of the misconceptions or the myths of kind of what was going on in our life, or even the way that different generations or different bosses or supervisors had described us. And so it was really powerful to sit down and hear people say that, we'd been told that we were entitled, or we were the lazy generation, or we were kind of nomads, like not wanting to be at a job for very long, or even not really wanting a job. And I think it was powerful to just hear kind of that everyone in that room had experienced someone saying that to them, and those similar feelings that came up. But I think it's also a place where I think we all realize the expectations that maybe other people have on us, for the good and the bad. And so it was just really interesting, I think, to state some of the things that are untrue about millennials, if we will, and kind of how I think in some ways it's how do we grow from that, and how do we kind of maybe change some of that perspective and persona that maybe we are not those things.
And I think too, off of the misconceptions, a lot of times there is the misconception that it's natural, so you should just experience it and move on, which it is going to be a natural feeling that once you start maybe moving into a career that you've been studying for your whole life, or maybe not, that you're going to feel this tension. And we'll talk probably a little bit more about imposter syndrome. I think Emily and I both experience this a lot as counselors when we're sitting with people and we're going, you are asking me for help? Me? Are you sure? Because I don't know if I know what's happening. So there is that level of it is natural, but that doesn't take away from the feeling and the bit of crisis it can put you in. And so just being aware that that's okay as well is just very important. I think my mom is the only person that I know that starting in elementary school, she knew she was going to be a math teacher, and she's been teaching math for over 30 years. And she is one of the very few people that I know didn't have any other careers but that career. And I just that idea that we're going to hop into a career and stay in it for 30 years, that's a misconception. She's a rare bird and she loves it. But I think just being aware that that's also a possibility. And so how do we know when we're in a quarter life crisis? We've kind of been talking about that a lot. But for me, what started happening was career searching. I started recognizing that even though I was in a full-time job that at the time I did love, I found myself wondering and thinking about, well, what if I tried something else? Or what if I did something else? Or I was searching for different jobs in the area. I was searching for different jobs in a lot of other areas of the country as well. And so it was something that started to consume my time. And even that doesn't have to necessarily look like that for you. It could also just be like you have your degree and now you're searching for that career and trying to figure out what you want to do. It can also look like that.
Yeah, I was similar to Haley. I was definitely looking for jobs while I was at a full-time job. And I think I was in some ways like kind of starting that to fall into the trap a little bit of what's the next best thing? Like what I'm in now isn't good enough. And so there's got to be something better, something that provides more money or more flexibility and I think I just started looking for something else and figuring out kind of what were the things I loved and what did I want. And those can be hard questions to answer, especially if it's kind of the first time in your life you're exploring it, as you're trying to figure out what you want, but also who you are. And then I do think for me, when I look back kind of on that quarter life crisis, and maybe I've had a few of them, I think living alone was an interesting thing as well. Coming out of college, I lived with a lot of roommates, and so was used to kind of doing immediate life with people. And there's a shift that happens when you start living alone that I think initially I thought, I'm growing up, I'm being an adult, I'm living alone. And then there's all these other things that I'm not prepared for I don't know that I want to be alone. And why don't I have people here all the time? And so that definitely was true when I was kind of in the midst of that, was definitely working on some of those feelings of loneliness.
I definitely agree with what you're saying about living alone. There is this element of you no longer have those roommates to help share in the weight of your bills, or you don't have someone that's also even helping decorate. Like something as silly as like, oh, now I have to make sure like, oh, I have to buy the couch. Oh, I have to buy, like you're no longer sharing that with someone. And so living alone is that time of just, it can be a complete introspective time because you're really figuring out who you are when nobody else is around. You figure that out. Am I that person that goes home and veggies on Netflix all the time because there's nobody there to tell me otherwise? Or am I that person that goes home and runs a marathon? I don't know. Whichever side of the spectrum you're on, that's good for you. And so that's how you know too, like if you are living alone, or maybe you have recently moved out of your parent home and you're figuring that out, what it looks like. And you could also be in this crisis, not living alone with roommates and trying to navigate that as well. And that's kind of where we move into that navigating relationships. You are starting to move into this area of your life where maybe you no longer want to go out every single weekend because you recognize either you want to get up early or you have something else on your plate, whereas other friends are not there. They don't necessarily agree with that. You're navigating what those friendships can look like for you. And if they're serving you well, which is a hard place to be because I think we all experience it when we go to college. We had our high school friends. Some of those stay intact. Some of them are different. But then even as you graduate college and move into the quote unquote real world, there is this another level of who are going to be the people that are going to continue to stick with you. Because with college, you're going out all over the place, different jobs. And so you begin to navigate what relationships look like, especially romantic ones as well. The person that you were with all through college, is that the person that's going to be with you all through life? I don't know. It's hard to say. And so navigating relationships is also that time where you are becoming more aware of, is this where I want to go, or am I wanting to switch directions?
Yeah, I think the relationship piece was very instrumental, and I think my quarter life crisis, for both the good and the bad. I think for me, the relationship I had been in all in college, and kind of thought I think I'd be in the rest of my life, ended, and that contributed to some of the quarter life crisis. And I think me trying to think through who I was and what I wanted to do outside of that relationship. But even friendships and community in college, I think I didn't realize the value that when everyone's in the same season of life, life is much easier. And it's much easier to connect, and it's much easier to probably disconnect. It's easier of what you're going to do for the day, what your rhythms look like. And so when kind of after graduation and even early on in my career, not everyone was in the same stage of life. You're walking into an office where you've got people of all ages. Some people are having children, some people have grandchildren, some people, and so you're just all of a sudden the common thing that I had with my community was no longer there. And so I think I was trying to find out who those people were, and who I was going to kind of do life with, no matter what was kind of going on in my life or what season of life we were in. And then it kind of leads to that making long-term personal and professional decisions, right? I think even now, Haley and I joke all the time, like, oh gosh, we have to make an adult decision. And we both are laughing. We both made really big adult decisions in the last week, this week. And so it still feels like that. It still feels like we're making those adult decisions or kind of long-term decisions. But I think in the midst of figuring out who I was and what I wanted to do, I kind of had to start to make those decisions. And like Haley said, like, where did I want to live? Where did I want to, to kind of grow and plant roots and build a family and have a home. And I think that all of that contributed to those decisions of kind of what was next for me. And so trying to navigate that and have some sort of goal of like, this is what I'd love to do. And what are the small steps I need to take to get there?
I think also in the midst of, as you're navigating what all this is, you get a sense of decision fatigue. You're being presented with so many options. So let's say you want to be a teacher. Well, you could be a teacher anywhere. And so you get this option of like, well, do I want to live across the country? Do I want to live just a state away? And then you start making those decisions. And then as you land on a location, it doesn't get any easier. And oh, now where am I going to live? All of these different pieces. And so you get overwhelmed with all of these decisions that you're having to make. And it can also create a sense of self-doubt. You begin to think, well, I have to make all these decisions and I'm already tired of making these decisions. So therefore, I don't even know if I can make good decisions. And in a Counseling Today article I was also reading about, it talks about how there's also this sense, like if you potentially think you might be in a quarter life crisis, you might also feel almost like a sense of betrayal. Like in some ways, we've been told you do good things will happen. Well, in today's world, we're coming out of a pandemic. Well, it's all in the air right now. But as we're navigating coming out of that, we have been told, like, go to school, get your degree, and then you'll get a great job. That may not be what happens. And that it can be almost like, I was told my whole life that. So you feel betrayed by your path. You feel betrayed by even either parental guidance or even guidance counselor guidance of like, I did the things right, but it's not working out how I thought it would. And even like, as Emily was sharing, like even with relationships, like I did all that I could and then it still didn't work out. And so there is that sense of, well, shoot, I tried to do it all and it still didn't turn out that way. So these are some ways that you may know that you're in a quarter life crisis. And then even just to kind of take it a little step further, Erik Erikson is a counseling theorist. He talks a lot about just the different stages of development. And we see quarter life crisis in this stage of intimacy versus isolation. It's that sixth stage. It's young adulthood, which I love that huge gap of 19 to 40, because a 19-year-old and a 40-year-old beside each other, I don't feel like makes, they're not going to have a lot of similar things, but really, maybe they do have a lot of similarities that they're maybe not willing to admit. But at its best, when you are functioning at your best in this stage, you're going to see not only fulfilling romantic relationships overall are going to be thriving. They're going to be places that you can go to get life. They're going to be the people you can lean on and people you can turn to. Or at its worst, with isolation, it's lonely, it's isolating. Even your health can be affected by isolation. And really the big question through this whole stage is, will I be loved or will I be alone? And so that can look like, honestly, I think at times when we begin to ask ourselves questions like that, we start reaching for things. We start reaching for, well, if I'm worried about being loved, well, I have to find a way to be loved. And that can look like reaching to our phones for social media to get that kick of dopamine from being on social media and someone liking our photo. Or it can look like, really social media is the big one, because that's that false sense of intimacy with somebody because you're not really in the room or on Zoom. I feel like you can create intimacy via Zoom now because you're actually talking to somebody, but there is that false sense of intimacy that is created. And so just being aware of like, where am I really on that spectrum? Am I leaning more towards creating intimate relationships or just close relationships? Or am I teetering towards isolation? because with isolation, that can happen for a number of reasons. You may isolate yourself and not even be aware of it. That could come from childhood trauma that you're unaware of, divorce. It can come from even just a fear of commitment and intimacy. It can be scary to commit yourself to even just a friendship to somebody because you don't know how things are going to pan out. It takes a lot to like allow somebody else to see you for who you are and then trust that they'll be able to like meet you where you are as well. And again, like that can be pretty damaging to isolate yourself to the point of like there's nobody around you that's going to be able to help you in the middle of this crisis. There's nobody that you can even confide in. And that's where we see a lot of people kind of turning to therapy, is that they've gotten to the point where nobody in their life is able to encourage them or really maybe even knows. I've seen clients that they don't like, people around them don't know they're in therapy. They're in this quarter life crisis range, but they're just so afraid to be like, I'm unhappy with the stage of life that I'm in and I don't know where to go from here. And so that is kind of that intimacy versus isolation.
Yeah, I love that question, Haley, that you've got there of will I be loved or will I be alone? Which I think is such a core identity question when it comes to friendships, relationships, and even like within a career. And I think, yeah, I think it speaks to that idea of intimacy versus isolation. And I think at the end of the day, everyone wants to be fully known and fully loved. I think all of us don't, I think all of us would agree we don't love rejection. We don't love fear. We don't love maybe even the unknown to some degree. And that will I be loved or will I be alone, I think hits it so well of, am I going to feel like have a group of people, have a community, have people who have my back and know me and say, we know you and we're here. And it's even that follow-up of, will I be loved? Will people, once they know me and know the real me, will they still love me? Or is what I'm posting on social media just what I need, the life I need to continue to live in order for them to love me? So I think that question is goes back to our own kind of core identity of who we are as human beings and who we want to be. And I think it also makes me think about kind of other people who kind of fall in this, not only this 19 to 40 stage, but even the 20 to 30 stage. It makes me think back to people that I know that are maybe early 20s as I'm more of later 20s. And I think that question is something that I think I want to keep in my back pocket to be able to potentially use as a kind of a benchmark for people as I'm talking to them and as friends, but also in the counseling room, right? Of maybe trying to help them unpack what they would answer of will I be loved or will I be alone? So I think that's a great identity question as well for us.
I'll also share, I've started asking, and I don't know if anybody else can relate to this, but when you start making decisions, I feel like there's almost this age in our mind that we think of ourselves as. So real-time example, I just purchased a car, and that is to me, it was a very stressful situation, but in my mind, I'm an 18-year-old trying to make a decision. And I go back to that age whenever big things happen, because in my mind, I'm incapable of being able to accomplish it really wasn't as horrible as I thought. But I think that's something to start asking yourself, like, is there a certain age that I think I'm stuck at? Because if that's the case, you may act in a way that is reflective of that age. So like me thinking I'm an 18-year-old, I believe that I'm not as equipped as I actually am to be able to make decisions. So maybe think through that. Is there an age that I feel almost like that Peter Pan, like I'm always stuck at 16? Or maybe, I don't know, maybe you're like, I am stuck at 10. That's where we're at. And I'm fine with that. And that's where I'm at. So just, again, asking yourself, a lot of this quarter life crisis is just asking yourself some hard questions of just being aware of it's a lot of just self-awareness. And that can be really hard because it's almost like we are taught to be aware of ourselves, but not on that intimate level. We're taught how to be aware of how we look and how we present to people or what we want, but to be aware of even deeper, that again, like Emily was saying, like, will I be loved or will I be alone? Like at the root of it is that's what's causing me to act in the way that I do. So as we move on even to the 4 stages. So this sounds encouraging. You're like, oh yes, great. 4 stages, we move in and out of them, no problem. No, that's a lie. It's a joke. 4 phases that you may at any point go, you may be in one phase and go right back to the first phase. Or you may have thought you graduated from the phases and all of a sudden you're feeling this exact same stage come back up again. So just being aware that even though these are the ideal phases, with therapy, we will tell you this, and with counseling and in life in general, healing of any sort is not linear. You're not just going to come into counseling and go, swoop, everything's great. You're going to go up, you're going to go down, you're going to go all the way around. and, and that's okay. That's part of the process. But the Harvard Business Review is actually the one that came up with these 4 stages of quarter life. So typically you start with that feeling of being trapped. So that could be you're trapped in your job, you're trapped in, it could be a commitment with another person. It could be that commitment. Let's say you've signed a 2-year agreement with your job, or even a lease. Like I feel like when you start to, maybe you're renting a place, there is that, oh gosh, I can't move for a whole year. Like that is that feeling of being trapped. And then that can move you into separation or loneliness. So if you were feeling trapped in a relationship and you chose to step out of it, that's going to create separation or loneliness. Or maybe you moved cities to pursue that career. You're going to start to feel loneliness as you adjust to maybe living somewhere that you didn't know anybody. When I moved here, I only knew a handful of people. And even though I had a handful of people, there was still seasons of loneliness of just navigating, oh, wow, this is not, I came from a very small town where everybody knew everybody. And that is just not the area that we live in. I mean, it is smaller than what we think, but nevertheless, stepping into that phase of, okay, wow, I don't really know anybody. But in those seasons of separation or loneliness, you also get a chance to reflect or recalibrate, reevaluate. Where do I want to go? Who do I want to be? Who do I want to hang out with? Are there new activities I want to pursue? Is there something that I just want to start trying because I am able to do that? And then that leads into exploration. So, all right, what am I going to do with what I've reflected on? Am I going to explore other careers, or I'm going to, maybe I love my career and I've settled on that, but I want to explore other places to live?
Yeah, I want to echo kind of what Haley said at the beginning too. These are phases, and you're probably going to hop in and out of them multiple times. And I think even I noticed for me when I felt like I got to that exploration phase, and I started thinking about, okay, what do I want, and what do I want to do, and where do I want to be? I almost started to feel trapped, because it was like, oh gosh, I feel like, okay, I know I want to do something that's helping people. And so now I'm trapped in the helping people career categories. And so I think just knowing it up front that you're going to go kind of from phase to phase, it's just all part of it. And I think it's important to recognize that those first 2 phases, that feeling trapped and that, separation or loneliness, I think those are, kind of more of the negative and really hard and trying feelings that you're going to have. And so obviously as a counselor, we like to talk about our feelings, but I think just recognizing that off the bat, that there is a space in the midst of a quarter life crisis where it's normal to feel alone, and it's normal to feel trapped. And I think if we don't recognize that, like Haley said, we kind of think it's this linear, just whoop, 1, 2, 3, 4, here we go. And it's not that way. And so I think recognizing that those first 2 are kind of, those initial feelings are hard, and they might even be, they might even be scary. They might even trigger some things from your past that you had no clue, even still bothered you maybe. But I think it's just important to recognize that. It kind of feels like the first 2 are those uphill steps. But I really think once you kind of pivot and make the shift and the turn to reflecting and exploring is kind of when I think some of the pressure valve is released a little bit. You feel like, oh, I can dream a little. Oh, I can, think about what would it look like to live here, or what would it look like to go back to school 5 years later after you've graduated undergrad, and what could life look like if I pursued that? And so I think the second half feels really exciting. There's some fear and unknown that comes with that too, as again, you kind of making those what feel like larger, more adult decisions. But I think it's just important to recognize that there's some normalcy in the feelings of trapped and loneliness in the midst of also trying to explore and figure out what you want.
I would say too, as I'm looking over these stages, I think the ones that are the most daunting are the ones you can get stuck in if you don't recognize what's happening and you don't reach out for help. So that feeling of being trapped, obviously I'm talking about getting stuck in that stage, but if you feel trapped but you don't make any movement, you're going to continue to feel trapped. Or let's say you felt trapped, you made movement and now you're lonely, and instead of taking that time to recognize it as a chance to reflect or recalibrate, you're instead staying in that separation, lonely, feeling trapped phase. It's easy to stay there. I think it's harder to want to like explore because it seems almost, or maybe for some people it is like you almost dream so much that you can never actually take a step either way too. But being stuck in those first two can feel the most daunting. And I would say that's probably the times that people are most driven to come see Emily or I. I'm like, I'm feeling trapped, I'm separated or lonely. And it's cool because within therapy, you get a chance to bridge on to that next stage of, well, let's recognize that, but how can we recalibrate this season for you? And that's really where we move into redefining what a crisis is. I think it's given this negative connotation of, it's a quarter life crisis and it's defined as a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. Yeah, that's there. It's difficult, it's troublesome, but you also get a chance to redefine, explore, and rediscover. I think a lot of times, I know in my quarter life crisis, it's almost like it brought me back to the original purpose I was pursuing in my life of, I knew I was done in the career that I was in. I knew I wanted to jump into helping people, but I didn't know, like, getting a chance to redefine what that looked like for me. Given my experience of my past career, I was able to go, well, I know I want this, but I don't want that. And so it was a scary time, but it was also an exciting time to be able to go, when else in my life will I get a chance to refigure this out? Because I am single, I am making these decisions for myself. So when else can I just take a fresh look at life and go, all right, let's make some more intentional decisions that better line up with my goals and the direction I want to go.
Yeah, I think the first thing about being in a crisis is recognizing that you're in a crisis. I think sometimes maybe culturally we want to just deny that or run from it or say, no, like I have it all together. I have it all together. And I think that ultimately makes the crisis worse and only enhances the feeling of loneliness and confusion and questioning, I think so much more. So I think the first step and really is just owning the fact that I feel like I'm in a little bit of crisis mode. And, hopefully I think why Haley and I are passionate about this topic is, like she said earlier, it's something that I think we just don't talk about enough. I think this is natural for most people in their 20s and 30s to go through, and maybe even go through it again at 40 to 50. And so I think it's just knowing that you're in a little bit of crisis, and it doesn't mean that everything's bad and everything has to be, changed and new in your life, but it does mean that there are some different perspectives and responses that you are to take in the midst of crisis.
Yeah. And I think one thing I've started telling people is maybe you start with rearranging your room. Instead of rearranging your life, maybe what we need to do first is move the couch to a different wall, put a different picture up, buy a plant. I don't know what that is, but maybe there's something, instead of making an overhaul of your life in the middle of a crisis, which we'll hit on. That's probably not what you should do. Instead, make small movements towards, okay, maybe I'll just throw some paint up, or maybe I'll do that. And that's really, or we move into what not to do when you're in a crisis. No major decisions. So yes, you're in this crisis mode and maybe you go, okay, solution, I need to move cross country. Well, what has happened here? Maybe you've lived in Tennessee, you're moving to California. What happened in Tennessee is going to follow you to California. You'll just be in a different environment. And it's very possible you won't even be around anybody that actually knows you there, which could only make that crisis even more hard for you, as you're like, oh, wow, I moved cross country and I don't know anybody. That could be hard, invalidating yourself, believing kind of like what Emily was saying, like, no, I'm not in crisis. This is not what it is. Because I think within our age, when we get on social media, we see people succeeding in areas that we're not. And so if we feel like we're in crisis, we'll almost invalidate ourselves because we don't want to admit that we're in crisis because we see it as a failure. Like, I'm failing because I'm in crisis. Well, that's not true either. Shutting off your feelings can also do a lot of damage because, again, like Emily was just saying, when you shut those off, you're not helping yourself. It's almost like, when you go to push, when we all used to swim all the time, when you try to push a beach ball under the water and it keeps coming back up, that's what you do when you shut off your feelings. Like, okay, I'm feeling kind of anxious, so I'll just shove it down. It's going to come back up depending on if you're holding it or if you're not, and it shoots out. And like, maybe you're becoming a little bit more irritable with the people around you, or maybe you're find yourself like your heart rate races every time you go to work, or you're sleeping more. It'll come out in a different way if you try to shut off your feelings. And then, yeah, I don't know, Emily, if you want to jump in as far as compensating goes.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't click unmute quick enough. Yeah, I think that, kind of those last three are really interesting, especially that retreat and that compare on social media. I think those are, and those are traps that we can get in really quickly, especially I think with how much we are communicating digitally. And some of that's great. And some of that, there's a shadow side to all of that as well. And one of the things I was thinking of as Haley was kind of talking as well is one of the questions I think I usually ask myself to figure out kind of maybe my health or wellness check kind of level in the midst of crisis is when I start making decisions, am I running to something or am I running from something? And I use that often in therapy, but I think I use that often in my own life of, am I running to something because I'm excited? And sure, there's fear and unknown there, or am I just running from what was? And I don't want to deal with any of that. And I want to shut my feelings off. I want to retreat. And so I'm just going to run from all of that. And so that's a really good, I think, tool to have, especially in your self-reflection of, am I running to or am I running from? And then one of the best things, I think, advice someone ever gave to me, I think it might have actually been my counselor, in the midst of crisis, in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of, I would say, transition in general, to always be really slow in the turns. I think we sometimes just want to make that immediate turn and make it a 90-degree and again, go different directions. And I'm constantly reminding myself to go slow in the turns. And so I think it's the same in crisis, is kind of what not to do. And these are all natural, and I think are some of my go-tos for sure. I have to kind of pull myself out of that and remind myself, hey, we're going to go slow in the turns in this. So yeah, those are just two things I usually use, not only in therapy, but in my own life.
Yeah, that triggered something too. I think our generation, we have the rise and grind generation of, we've been taught like, I'm going to get up, I'm going to do all the things, I'm going to be successful. And then I have a psychologist that I love. She's on Instagram if anybody wants hers, but she talks a lot about how problematic the idea of the rise and grind culture is, because if you're not rising and grinding, then you're feeling disappointed, disgusted with yourself, overwhelmed. But she was even talking about during the pandemic when, and if any of you all chose to do this, there's nothing wrong with it, but like, she was saying, everybody was talking about like, I'm going to learn a new language, I'm going to train for a marathon. And she made a statement of like, you're in a crisis. Why would you tack on more things to yourself in the middle of a crisis? Maybe the goal is just to survive at that point, and recognize that you don't need to add on one more thing in the middle of a crisis. And the same is true here. Like, whenever you start to spiral, maybe you're like, well, the solution is I'll just add on like a part-time job, or I'll add on I'll start hanging out with more people. No, maybe the thing you do need to do is like not do any of that. Instead choose, no, I'm in a crisis. I need to not try to force myself into a new experience for the sake of, if it's not for the sake of like exploring if it's for good, but instead you're trying to do it to retreat or just shut off your feelings, there's a difference there. And like internally, like, am I doing this kind of like what she was saying, what Emily was saying, am I running to something or am I running from something as I'm trying to explore these options? So what do you do in the middle of your crisis? And we've kind of laid out a few different just options. Pausing. I was again reading an article and it talked about auditing your day. So as you're looking at your day, I think, again, that rise and grind culture tells us to go throughout a day and have it completely jam-packed with things to do. But whenever we actually pause and are made aware of whatever we're doing in a whole day, we look back and we go, oh my gosh, maybe you did spend the whole day on Netflix. Okay, well, go ahead and make an audit of that. Is that something you want to be a part of your life in the future? And are you okay with that? But just auditing your day and even just trusting the discomfort that comes when you pause, because it can be uncomfortable for us to pause. It's uncomfortable for us to sit in a room without our phones, without any form of distraction. So it feels uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong. The discomfort is there to show you something, just like your anxiety and your anger are there. They're not there to hurt you. They're really trying to reveal something within you so that you're able to evaluate where you want to be. And then for me, in the middle of me trying to navigate where I was going to go, having a core few is what was very important for me. I had to have people in my life and in my corner that I knew were invested in me and where I was going, and that they weren't looking at my decisions as what's the best way to say it? What's the nicest way to say this? They weren't looking at my decisions as like benefiting them or taking away from them. They were looking at my life objectively going, if you make this decision, this will be a really good move for you, not because of anything they gained or lost from it. They were able to help me evaluate and knew what was best for me and allowed me to make decisions, even if they didn't agree with them. They were like, if that's what's best for you, that's what's best for you. And so when you're in this season, I think we all like to have multiple people inputting because it almost makes us feel good. Like, oh, hey, should I buy this outfit? And so you ask all these people, should I buy this outfit? But in this specific season, you need to keep it to a core few and keep it tight so that you are able to have just those trusted voices. And again, for me, if I would have consulted with people that were working with me, they wouldn't have had an objective view. They would have tried to change my mind because me leaving would have impacted them negatively. And so keeping that in mind as well.
I was the same way when my quarter life crisis happened, especially when that relationship, the long term, what I thought was going to be a long term relationship ended. I can remember sending a text to 5 people. And those became my 5 core people. I think in part, I didn't want to talk to a bunch of people, but I also didn't want to isolate and retreat like we talked about earlier. And so I did. I texted 5 people, and those 5 people decided to walk me through it. And like Haley said, they wanted what was best for me and they wanted what I wanted, whatever that was. And I think those are the people you're looking for who will help you kind of figure out those next steps, that their dog in the fight is you and only you. And they want you to be okay. And they want you to ultimately, get whatever you're hoping for and accomplish those dreams and goals. So I absolutely think that, there's seasons of life where I think you need tons of people and the more the better. But I think there's also seasons where you just need the core few who will continually check in on you and kind of walk right by your side through all that. And that kind of obviously leads to that evaluation stage. They're going to help you evaluate all that. They're going to help you. What are pros and cons? For me, it's helpful to write those things out and look at those things and weigh the options. And I think even I needed help in saying, what are the options? Like, what are the options for what's next? And obviously, Haley and I are biased because we're both therapists, but we believe so much healing and hope can happen within therapy. And so it's always okay to reach out for help. And it's always okay to just say, hey, I just need someone to talk to who has kind of a 30,000 foot view and isn't necessarily in the daily nitty gritty with you, but can help kind of broaden some of that perspective. And Haley and I both are therapists. We also have our own therapists. And so I think it'll be that way probably for the rest of our life. And I think we're both okay with that. And so it's not anything to be ashamed of or to run from, but I think it's super healthy. And it's really a great step to take I just need someone to kind of help me sort out what all my options are.
Yeah, I agree. And for therapy, it may not be you're with your therapist for the rest of your life. It may be you just need therapy to navigate a big decision because maybe you are lacking in that core few compartment. That doesn't mean your therapist is your best friend, but it could be like you are lacking in that core few. So you do want to be around a person who can look at it objectively with you and help you be empowered to make that decision. And then we jump into self-care and self-compassion. Now, self-care is a buzzword. Self-compassion, I don't feel like we talk about as much in regard to self-care, but you cannot do effective self-care if you don't have effective or productive self-compassion. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit because that's also an important piece of navigating during a crisis. So self-care is as defined as the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's own health. What I have learned is that self-care is unique to you. I think a lot of times we have this misconception that self-care looks like a bubble bath, it looks like a face mask, it looks like a massage. And while those are great things for some people, for other people to have that done or to do that is exhausting or they just don't want to. And so being aware of how self-care is unique to you. I recently saw a post on Instagram and I actually shared it with Emily, but it encompassed self-care as water intake. How much water are you drinking a day? Maybe that just needs to be what you focus on, is drinking more water. Your diet and nutrition. Overload of sugar excess has been linked to multiple health issues, as well as like that kind of reveals where you are as well in life. Am I consuming only sugar because I'm trying to run away from my feelings? Or am I not eating anything at all because I'm really afraid of what's going on? Your sleep. Sleep is a major part of self-care. Maybe you're one of those people that you're like, oh, I can survive off of 4 hours of sleep. Well, talk to me about how the rest of your life is going. Are you relaxed at work? Are you peaceful? When you do sleep, is it restful sleep or are you constantly up and down? Also, how do you manage stress? Are you one of those Netflixers that just chills out, or are you Netflix and chill, or are you someone else? Like, how does that look for you? As well as physical activity. Are you getting outside? Vitamin D is also super important to be able to have successful, not successful, or just have healthy mental health. And Emily, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to share on self-care before we jump into self-compassion.
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's unique to you. Discover the things that are life-giving to you, and that make you feel rested and whole again. And those are 100% unique to you. And the good thing and bad thing is you get to decide what those are. People can kind of help you and guide you, but at the end of the day, you get to make that choice. And I think we're going to talk about self-compassion here in a second. And there was a quote that Haley sent me that we have on this slide. And I won't read all of it because I want to make sure we leave some time to answer any questions. But basically, it just talks about how the benefit of self-compassion is that it's not just about replacing negatives with positive, but there's actually something internally that changes. And even within the brain, there are positive emotions and positive responses when you begin to include all of that. And a lot of healing and restoration and wholeness can take place when we do that. So it's greater than just kind of adding and subtracting things in our life.
And to be clear, self-compassion is not self-esteem. The goal is not for you to be able to make a post on social media about how wonderful and great you are and how you have this confidence. It's not that. It's also not self-pity on the other end of that spectrum of, I feel so bad for myself, so I should go buy myself 20 pairs of shoes. Like, that's not what we're going for either. And that would also fall into the category of self-indulgent. Like, oh, because I'm giving myself compassion, I deserve to go whatever that looks like for you or your preference. And so those are the things that it's not. But what it is looking at self-kindness versus self-judgment. Here's the deal. Being imperfect, it's what happens. We're all imperfect. It is inevitable. And instead of judging yourself for that, you're made aware of it and you choose to be kind over judging yourself for it. I always like to think about how people say, are you treating people the same way you treat yourself? Now that can be, for some people, that's the opposite. You treat people terrible and you treat yourself great. That's something to be aware of. But just, are you like your friends, I always like to ask clients, are you, the way that you're speaking about yourself, would you say that exact same thing to your best friend? If that's the case, maybe you need to change some stuff, or that's not the case, you need to change some stuff. It's also being aware that it's common humanity versus isolation. Suffering is just a part of like what we're going to go through. Crises are going to happen, and being aware of that. And so I think a lot of times when it's going on, we have on our mind, because we have isolated ourselves, that this is an attack on me. This is only happening to me. Nobody else is going through what I'm going through. Nobody else can understand. And that's just not accurate. When you get around other people, their story may not look like your story, but their suffering and what they're going through can also be very similar. And that can be very helpful. And then also mindfulness versus over identification. Let's be honest, the quarter life crisis concept is becoming a bit of a buzzword. And social media has also been all about talking about mental health. And I think it's easy for you to see like quarter life crisis and think you're in the middle of a crisis because you want to over identify with that. But when you stop and observe your own thoughts and feelings, maybe that's not where you are. Maybe you just need to make a little pivot. Or maybe you read about depression and you're like, that's me. Well, is that really you when you stop and you like identify your thoughts and feelings? And that's where it can really help to have that core few, because they can also help you be aware of what that looks like and if that is where you're going.
Yeah, so I think the question we'd ask is what now, right? What do we do with all this information? And I think it's probably starting with ourselves, right? Starting with our own self-reflection and our own, forms of self-care and self-compassion, and kind of figuring out, maybe have we been through a quarter life crisis before? Are we in one now? But kind of adjusting to what that might be. So I feel like we've got a lot of information. I want to make sure we leave space if anyone has questions for us to ask, so we can kind of do that the last 7 or so minutes we have, I think. But if you need to take a deep breath, inhale, exhale before we begin that is great. So we will take whatever questions you guys might have. I think I can see the questions. Give me just 1 second. Sorry. Yes. So Haley, here's one we have. As an older adult, how can I support someone who is in a quarter life crisis?
Ooh, what a good question. I would definitely say like validating their experience. I think our generation, I feel like there's always been this tension between the older generation, and I'm not even saying how old, has this conception that the younger generation doesn't want anything from them. Whereas the younger generation, we want to be able to like glean from your wisdom, but also not feel judged if we're not where you are. And so just being aware of like, people want the wisdom that you have, but also be patient of, it may not look how you expect it to look for our generation now. We have the resources to live a life very differently than how our parents live. We have the ability to, maybe we're pursuing a career for 2 years and shift, and that's perfectly okay. So I would say just extending a lot of grace and helping to validate the experience is a great place. And also just I always think it's great to start off with like, what can I do to help you? Instead of automatically being like, let me tell you what you need to do. Like, no, offering that question of like, what is it that you need?
Yeah, I would echo the same thing, Haley. I think it's allow them to be heard. If they're in a quarter life crisis, they just want to be heard. It's back to that, am I going to be alone, and am I going to be loved, right? They want to feel loved and they don't want to feel alone. And I think the thing I've said about, I think all generations in general, but yeah, I think Haley's right. There's been tension. I think at the end of the day, we're all better together. And so I think it's our generation not stiff arming the generation above us, and the generation above us not stiff arming us. And I think saying, hey, yeah, I don't know. In some ways I've been where you've been, and in some ways it looks really different. And so knowing that, and not maybe wanting to rebel against that, but rather saying, let's come together. So I think coming alongside people who are in quarter life crisis is great. And I think people our age and in that crisis, they, like Haley said, they want your wisdom. They want what you can offer. And so I think it's important that we try and do that together.